Ladies and gentlemen, today I'm going to be making my early 2025 NHL Free Agency predictions, predicting where the top free agents might end up landing. Of course, we're still in the middle of the NHL playoffs up to this point, but I want to make my early predictions to see which teams can make the big splashes, especially with how many big-time forwards there are in this class. There's a lot of different ways this free agency could go. But which teams do I think will be the big spenders this summer, and where do I see some of the top free agents like Nikolaj Ehlers, Matt Duchene, Mitch Marner ending up? Well, make sure you watch till the end as we go through all the predictions here today, and hit that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey content just like this, especially as we lead up to the free agency and all the content surrounding it this summer. Ben, something that has been all over the place in his value out there, but especially in the last couple of seasons has had some big ups and big downs. You see in 2023 was up to 78 points and 33 goals. He's been back down in the last couple of seasons, especially this year's playoffs. He's had some pretty rough moments, but in terms of the value out there, especially if we were to go on the open market, even though he wouldn't get a lot of term, still the pedigree he has, the reputation he has as a leader, I think could carry him a long way in terms of the current AAV. But let's be honest, I think most likely he's going to end up signing a 1-2 year type deal with the Stars, and especially down from $9.5 million, get a pretty decent pay cut. The big thing, though, is the lack of cap space for the Stars this offseason, having around $5.7 million to work with, which out of all the teams as of right now would be the least amount of cap space this offseason. Plus, you factor in players like Maverick Bourque being an RFA, the UFAs they have in Matt Duchene, Evgeny Dadonov, and on the defense, players like Cody Ceci, which I don't think will be re-signed, but still have to factor in there. The Stars are going to have a lot of really difficult decisions to make. Though I do think Ben, especially compared to Matt Duchene, which we'll talk about later, I think is the more likely for the Stars to keep, especially if that cap cut, which I think is going to be coming, does apply. I don't think he's going to get more than maybe $3 million when it's all said and done. And for the Stars, you'll still have a little bit to work with there, especially if they can somehow trade Matthew Dumba's contract. Now let's move on to another forward here, but something that I do think will go to the open market, and that will be Ryan Donato. Now it was interesting because it was kind of all over the place. It felt like he wanted to stay in Chicago when the trade deadline happened, but he wasn't traded. He stayed in Chicago, but I don't think ultimately he's going to end up staying there, even though the Blackhawks, of course, got a lot from him this season. Easily one of the most interesting performers on that team. You can see in 80 games, 31 goals, 31 assists, 62 points. Easily a career year for him, and honestly, the production and just how well he was playing, how good his finishing was, you do have to respect. I do think Donato is going to cash in, not extremely well. He's not going to get $7 million or anything, but I do think he's going to get a pretty healthy raise, up to potentially $4-5 million. I could easily see that, especially considering the term that he might end up getting. I don't think it's going to be all too crazy, but a team that I think could be an interesting fit is the Vancouver Canucks, especially with them being kind of all over the place when it comes to their center situation going forward. Now for the Canucks, I think we're going to see a lot of roster turnover for this team, especially this summer in the forward group. You have so many different players who could be off the team, especially from the free agency. You have players like Pia Suter, Brock Boeser, who will likely be leaving in UFA. And even though I think Elias Pettersson should be rebounding next season, you still have a pretty massive hole there at the center situation, especially if Philip Hedl and his health doesn't get any better. You could have Ryan Donato there, and even though he had played wing as well for Chicago too, you could place him on the left wing if we really needed to. I could see a situation where players like Hoglander as well are shipped off this offseason too. So I think for Vancouver, the versatility, especially for Donato, is something that I think will be really enticing for them, especially because for a lot of that forward group, I don't think they have much of a plan going forward. They want to get, I think, a lot more versatile. Donato does that. Of course, the AAV will be a big problem in the term, especially as Quinn Hughes' contract comes up. But I think for the Canucks, especially, this forward group is going to have to really be the focus because it's looking rough. Now, moving on to another player who I think will re-sign like a Jamie Benn situation will be Claude Giroux with the Ottawa Senators. Similar, I think, especially in the pay cut that could be coming, with Giroux in his last contract making $6.5 million. I don't quite see that happening again, but he's still a solid player. 50 points in 81 games this last year, but of course you can see a pretty big decrease in the goal scoring and the actual speed in his play, especially when you consider his first year in Ottawa where he got 35 goals, 79 points in 82 games. He's not that type of guy anymore, but I think he'll still be a very important part of that Senators forward group, especially with the leadership that he provides there, especially in that middle six. Likely more as a third line player going forward for them, but still a big part of that team. Though I think is very likely to get maybe below $4 million or so. I think in Giroux's case, especially if you want to see the Ottawa Senators win, they need every single penny they can get in that Canadian market. And especially with them in this offseason, they could go after some pretty big names. Giroux, though, I think to make that happen, would have to take a pretty big cut here. Next up, let's start out with the Florida Panthers and their multitude of different UFAs. And they're a team that I think is fascinating because they have so many guys that could be shed off this roster after this year. One of them on the defense being Aaron Ekblad. Now, of course, the suspension aside in his case, he is a fascinating one because he's been, of course, a lifelong Florida Panther, but somebody that's been all over the place in terms of his actual play, the defensive ability, how impactful he actually is shift to shift. I think in his greatest moments, especially when you go back to the cup run there, he was a massive part of that team defensively with the physical body he was able to provide and just how much of a stalwart he was. But again, the inconsistencies there, the injuries, he's kind of been somebody you can't really consistently rely on to be that type of guy, which is exactly when he's a little bit washed is exactly why he'll go to the Buffalo Sabres. Now, I don't even know how likely this is because I still think Aaron Ekblad will want a pretty big contract, but I look at all the defensemen that Buffalo is trying to sign, and Ekblad's kind of the type of player they've wanted to sign but never really had the chance at getting. I'm not sure how much I believe Ekblad is actually the answer, but I think he is more of a solution to the problem, especially when you look at that right side of the defense. It is still absolutely brutal. They've tried time and time again to sign different players or trade for different guys, and it just never really seems to have worked. The physical game in Ekblad's case is still at a top tier point. I think for Buffalo, if they're going to spend big, a player like Ekblad does make sense. Though, again, I'm not sure how impactful he's going to be on a long-term deal. I would be very hesitant to do that. But again, I think for a Buffalo that is desperate at this point, that desperation might create a pretty big contract in Ekblad's hands. I don't know. Maybe a team like Ottawa is maybe a more likely team to go for a player like Ekblad and actually spend that top dollar for him, but it's about time that Buffalo actually spends some money for somebody. In Ekblad's case, the jury's still out if it'll actually be useful or not, but at least it's a move in the right direction, hopefully. Next up, let's move on to the Florida Panthers and one of their top centers in Sam Bennett, an absolute rat out there and somebody that will get under your skin so consistently. I think Bennett is really due for a massive pay grade. He is somebody that is going to get a ton of money this offseason just for how consistently he gets under your skin and also the big time performances in the playoffs. You look in the last 3 years, especially for Florida, 15 points in 20 games in 2023, then 14 points in 19 games last year, and almost a point per game, 8 points in 9 games this season. He just elevates his game whenever the time is right, whenever the pressure is on. And I think especially for some teams that are looking to make that next step into the NHL playoffs in the future, Bennett is somebody that they'll really crave. There has been, of course, the conversations around Montreal, but ultimately the team that I do think will get him will be the Chicago Blackhawks. I think they're a team that already was extremely active in last year's free agency. Didn't exactly go the way they wanted, but I think especially up the middle is something they are looking to improve upon, and Sam Bennett, of course, would definitely do that, giving them a pretty legitimate second-line center behind Connor Bedard, which I think is something they'll really try to prioritize this offseason. In the past, they've gotten into free agency trying to get guys that were scary before, guys like Corey Perry, Pat Maroon, for example, but Sam Bennett is in the prime of his career and as scary as he's ever been, and I think for Chicago especially, they're going to give the bag to him. I don't even know how much it could end up being, but like maybe 7 years, 7.5 million. It could be something that high, and I would not be surprised by it. Now let's move on to the last big-time Florida Panthers UFA in Brad Marchand, who, of course, has been doing some big things against Toronto in this year's series. We'll see how much he's able to get in this year's free agency, considering he's 37 years old, but the name value is still there, and he's still doing some pretty great things in the playoffs. 8 points in 9 games so far, and you can't really deny just how consistent he's been in that regard. The physical play, the intensity, and, of course, the engagement he's able to get out of the other teammates, or other team, and just how consistently he gets under the skin of other players. He is something that I think teams will absolutely adore in this year's free agency, and I think we'll get more money than some people expect because he's Brad Marchand. I do think ultimately he will end up leaving Florida, but I do think the team that makes the most sense to me is the Detroit Red Wings, a team that I think could use a little bit more of the Marchand element, especially in their top 9. You, of course, already got Alex DeBrincat on that left side, but not a lot of, I think, true identity afterwards. You got players like Berggren and maybe Michael Rasmussen as a left winger long term, but Marchand, I think, could be an extra little bit of feistiness that they don't quite have as much of, especially after that top 6. Marchand, though, is able to do that while also still playing some pretty great hockey at his age. And of course, with how active Detroit has been in free agency over the years, I don't think they're going to stop now. Now let's keep going with the forward UFAs here and go on to Mikael Granlund. Now, he's one that I kind of went back and forth on because I do see a situation possibly where he just goes back to the San Jose Sharks. I don't think there's many fits that make a whole lot of sense for him. One team that I was potentially going for was the Columbus Blue Jackets. As we talked about before with potentially Adin Hill, Columbus has a ton of cap space. Though I do think in Granlund's case, he's going to get somebody that continues to get underpaid because he is something that has just continued to be an underrated player. Really, ever since he got onto San Jose after having a horrendous start with Pittsburgh, he has been amazing. And even though he hasn't been an unreal scorer for Dallas in the playoffs this year, he's had a big effect on the team and has been driving play in a lot of key areas. And you see in the regular season as well, 21 points in 31 games for them after having 45 points in 52 games for San Jose. He is still a legit top 6 piece. I do think more of a wing and more of a winger long term, at least that's where I see more of his value coming from, which for Columbus on that left side, they have a little bit of a hole there. They have players like Voronkov, of course, but I think Mikael Granlund could give them some extra bit of speed that they could use a little bit more of. And especially if Columbus continues to be aggressive afterwards, getting some more depth, a player like Mikael Granlund bringing another veteran there, I think is something the Blue Jackets might look for. But maybe they go for a bigger player, I'm not quite sure. But I would really like to see Granlund on that power play and that offense that already has a lot of really interesting weapons. Now let's go to one of the most fascinating free agents of this class in John Tavares. And we'll get into the Mitch Marners of the world eventually. And I'll spoil it right now. I do think John Tavares, out of the big UFAs Toronto has, is easily the most likely to stay with the Toronto Maple Leafs. I just have a feeling that there's not really much of a reason to leave. I mean, you look at what he's been able to do the past few years for Toronto, the offense and what he's been able to provide. He's put up some great numbers and pretty consistently. And even when you thought he was kind of reaching down to at a worse level, I mean, in 2024, 65 points is still quite solid. This year, he comes out, especially in the second half, and absolutely lights the world on fire. Almost gets back to a point per game, 74 points in 75 games and 38 goals. He still has it in him. He still has so much to give, and I think especially for the Leafs and in their center situation, I think they're going to want to keep Tavares in the end. He will get a pay cut under $11 million for sure, probably more so around the $7 million range, but I think it's something that I think, especially for the Leafs as a second-line center, is something they're going to want to prioritize into keeping, because really, they should. He's been a great piece for them, and especially afterwards, I think the center situation would get bleak if he were to leave. Now we go on to another center in this UFA class in Brock Nelson, of course, a transfer from the New York Islanders, getting traded at the deadline to the Colorado Avalanche. In Nelson's case, the move to the Avs was kind of up and down. He had some moments in the regular season, finishing with 13 points in 19 games there, but in the playoffs was a little bit of a non-factor, I would say, for them, and scored 0 goals in 7 games. 4 assists is all right, but I don't think was quite the impact player the Avs really wanted out of him. I still think he's a solid middle 6 centerman, but I do think his value is going to be a little bit more diminished than it otherwise would have been, which I think leaves a team like the Minnesota Wild, who have been heavily in on him, I feel like throughout this entire process, with a lot better of a chance to get him. Of course, Bill Guerin, who was the GM of the Four Nations for the U.S., had Brock Nelson on there when he could have gone for a lot of other options, so he obviously likes this player. We've heard so much interest about Minnesota potentially trading for Nelson in the end. Of course, he went for Colorado, or did go to Colorado instead, but I feel like for Minnesota, free agency makes a little bit more sense from to go after him. And let's be honest, for Minnesota, I mean, he's exactly, I think, what they would want to bring on as this big-time face-off ability player. Of course, Minnesota native, something that can bring some good goal scoring, especially on the power play. We'll have to wait and see. The jury's still on how effective he'll be long-term, but as of right now, I think he's something Minnesota especially will want to go after. Now, speaking of players the Minnesota Wild have been in on over the years, let's go on to another Minnesota native named Brock Boeser. Now, the interesting part about Boeser is that I don't think he'll actually end up being a Minnesota Wild. I think we're going to go to Brock Nelson's former team in the New York Islanders. I do think the Wild could be a potential fit, but I feel like they still want to give a big-time opportunity to Matt Boldy, and I think having Brock Boeser there would kind of complicate things a little bit. I think they'll go for a lower stakes middle 6 right wing in free agency. Brock Boeser, though, I think for the Islanders makes a lot of sense with the goal scoring that he can provide, the power play ability. Even though I don't think he brings as much speed as I would like to see the Islanders go after, he still can bring up some good goal scoring ability, especially in the last couple of seasons. 40 goals last year, 25 goals was a little bit of a down season this year, but I think in the right spot with the right center around him, he could do some pretty great things, and I still think he has a lot to give. Plus, you could pair him with Bo Horvat, have that pair back together. There's options there for the Islanders, but especially for them, I think they're going to be pretty aggressive this offseason, changing a lot of that roster up, and bringing in a player like Brock Boeser would certainly do that. Now, going on to the last few free agents here, let's go on to somebody that I think is going to get a massive pay raise upcoming in Matt Duchene of the Dallas Stars. Now, as much as I would like to see the Stars keep him. I just don't think there's any situation where that ends up happening. Unless they do some surgery into this roster and the cap space they have, I just don't see it as a possibility. Duchesne has taken some massive pay cuts, and this last year taking only $3 million on a one-year deal, which is just a travesty. He deserves way more than that. Even though I have some problems with the way he plays in the playoffs, I mean, the regular season and the production there, 82 points, 52 assists in 82 games this year. You can't deny just how much of an offensive presence that Duchesne continues to be when he is at his best. And even though, again, the playoff performances have been iffy, I will say that, I don't think that's going to matter much when we get into free agency and the teams that want to go after him, which is why I think a team like the Boston Bruins makes a lot of sense, because you, of course, have some big players that gone after in free agency like Elias Lindholm, but Duchesne, I think, brings some speed and some skill that they could really use up the middle. He's a definitive center there, and somebody that I think could bring a lot more success to the Bruins than some of their other free agency additions in the past. Plus, you could potentially have a player like Zacha on the wing as well, and it'll make it a lot better, that whole center situation for Boston in the end. I still don't think that's the be-all, end-all move, but I think for the Bruins, they're still want to be aggressive in this year's free agency because they still think they have a chance. I don't think they quite do, but Matt Duchesne would certainly make things better for them, even though they might improve to an 80-point team instead of a 70-point team. Now, moving on to one of the highest skill ceiling wingers of this whole class, let's go into Nikolaj Ehlers, who is something that I think for Winnipeg especially is something that I don't see being kept, though I would like to see it. I'm a big fan of Nikolaj Ehlers. I think he's something that for the Jets, they're going to want to go in a different direction with how many maybe defensive mistakes are happening out there, but I still love the speed. I still love the intensity and the skill set that Nikolaj Ehlers has in his greatest moments. He's something that just brings such dynamic elements, and you can see, even though the injuries have been a consistent problem for him over the last couple of seasons, back-to-back 60-point plus years, which I think is pretty huge for him. I think in Ehlers' case, though, he's likely to go into free agency, and a team that I think could be big spenders, but might only land one of the big names in a player like Ehlers, is the Calgary Flames. I do think there is the potential that they go in on a player like Mitch Marner, but I think with the Matt Coronado signing there, I think okay with their right wing situation as it is right now. The left side, though, has some holes. I think especially Ehlers with the speed he creates is something that I think the Flames could absolutely take advantage of. Plus, I don't think he's going to be an absolute bank buster. He's making $6 million this season, and of course, he will be a UFA this summer, but I don't think he's going to get a massive raise. Maybe he gets up to $7 million on a longer-term deal, but I don't think he's going to get much more than that, considering his injury history, the risk associated with him. I don't think there's going to be too much competition. But for a team like the Flames, it's kind of in a transition period. I feel like a player like Ehlers and the bet you can take on him is well worth the risk, especially for the high upside play that he can provide when healthy. But that, of course, leads us on to my most accounts, the #1 free agent of this class, in Mitch Marner of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, there also is the chance that the Leafs are able to keep Mitch Marner in the end, and Tavares. It is, I think, a little bit less likely, but there is still the case of that. But I do think in Marner's case, when we're looking at just the pure money he could make somewhere else, if he does want to leave Toronto, if there even is the possibility of that, I think there is going to be a team offering just more than Toronto simply can afford to offer. Of course, this last season got his first 100-plus point season in the NHL, 102 points and 75 assists in 81 games. He's something that has been up and down as well in the playoffs pretty much every single time, but still 12 points in 10 games up to this point. He's something that has its ups and downs. We know the faults, we know the strengths, and I think it's something that will, especially for some of those rebuilding teams out there, get a lot of interest in this year's FA period, especially for a team looking to add some juice, some pure skill to their forward group. I mean, there's nobody else even available that comes close to a player like Marner consistently. In the end, though, a team that we combine with the opportunity that they could give to a player as well as the cap space available, I think a team like the Anaheim Ducks can make a lot of sense. They don't have a ton of their right wing besides Troy Terry, but those two guys as your top two right wing, plus the forward group that already is around in the center situation there, there's a lot to work with. Plus, the Ducks, of course, have a lot of cap space, a lot of potential in the future. I think they're really going to want to prioritize this year making the NHL playoffs after their new head coach hiring. I think Mitch Marner would certainly bring an extra element of skill to that team that they don't quite have. Maybe it's a bit less likely because of the players they brought in. Maybe Marner isn't as physical as they'd want him to be, but I think with the opportunity at hand, they're going to want to go after him, and when it's all said and done, and go after him with a big contract. And ultimately, I think for Marner, I mean, you could make big money in Orange County. why the heck not? Plus, again, you look at that forward group and the opportunity that Marner could get pretty much immediately. Troy Terry is really the only big-time right wing that even gives him any competition whatsoever. But I think you could pretty instantly be on a first line with Cutter Gauthier and Leo Carlson, and I think those three guys could be absolutely dynamic together. But there's a lot of options to go through. Really, the left wing, the center situation is pretty well set, but the right wing side and how Anaheim goes with it in the future will be a situation to think about, especially when you have a player like Beckett Seneca coming up. I mean, imagining the right wing core of Marner, Terry, and Seneca. Oh my goodness, that would be insane. But honestly, I am all here for it. But those are some of my early predictions for the 2025 free agency period, and hope you guys did enjoy. Of course, comment down below your thoughts on my picks, what you guys agree and disagree with. And of all the free agents we talked about here today, where do you see them going when the free agency opens up? Do you see them going to your favorite team or somebody else? Let me know your thoughts down below. Of course, make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe and the notification bell for more videos just like this, and share the video with all the hockey fans you guys know online, as well as clicking on this card if you want some more predictions content just like today's video. But I will see you guys in the next one. Make sure you have a fantastic hockey day, and goodbye.